We're back in the shop today with our Project Diesel Gladiator. Now, this thing has been performing so well. I'm so happy with this thing. It is so much fun to drive. It is very capable off-road. We've been to South Dakota now, drove out there and drove back without the trailer, towing it and all that stuff. But we had a group of us, probably 8 to 10 guys, went to South Dakota. This thing performed great. Now, I did take a few bypasses because I thought, man, we're not gonna make it through here. It's pretty tight. We did cave in the bedside in one little spot, and you probably saw that in a previous video. Now, we're in here today to upgrade axles. So we've got 40-inch tires on stock Rubicon axles. Although these axles are pretty stout, I don't encourage someone to run 40-inch tires on stock axles. We've only had this truck for about 8 months. We've been on a dozen or more trips, and we've been very lucky that nothing has broken. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna yank the front axle out of this thing. We've got some RCB axles to put in it, an R-Tech truss, R-Tech gussets, R-Tech front axle disconnect skid, and we're gonna put a Revolution 488 gear set in it. And then of course we're gonna be taking this diff cover off. It's got a little mark here, a dent from where it has hit some rocks, and we'll inspect the factory ring gear, see if there's any evidence of that rubbing the ring gear. Now, when we go back together, I was going to use this cover and do the Next Venture Motorsports kind of diff skid that goes on there. We're going to take a look at that because in previous fitment times that we've tried to just maybe throw it on one day after work, it didn't fit. So we're just going to investigate that a little bit deeper, but we're going to go ahead and get this thing taken apart. I've already drained the differential. What I found unique on this one is I did not know that they don't have drain plugs in the front differential. Every JL or JT we've ever worked on has had a drain plug in the front differential. So I don't know if it's just 2022, 2023 models that don't have that. I'm not sure. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get this thing torn apart. So we've got the front axle upgrades to do, and then we also are going to replace the entire rear axle assembly with Dynatrack's new ProFloat Dana 60 rear. So that axle is going to be such that it's got 35 spline axles. It's still semi-float, but this ProFloat thing they're doing is supposed to be guaranteed for bent flanges and axle breakage longer than the standard 1-year warranty, I believe. I'll have to investigate that, but the reason we went with that is at the time we weren't going to do anything other than just what we're doing here. So kind of wish we had gone ahead and done 1-tons, 60, 80, been done with it, and but that is way more expensive. So we bought the rear axle for this truck, and then we're going to do some upgrades to the front axle. We're going to see how long this lasts. I think the rear axle will be plenty sufficient. It's got the same ground clearance as the factory axle, but way, way bigger. 4-inch axle tubes, I believe, on that one. And it's got bigger disc brakes on them. The outers are from like an F-150. And instead of having a single set 10 bearing out there on the housing end, it's going to have, I think, 2 like set 80 bearings or something to that effect. I'm not sure. I'll try to maybe link you to a video here from Dynatrack about some of their testing for deflection and impacts with the bent flange stuff that they've been doing. But anyway, we're going to go get this front end tore down and get going on it. Thanks for watching. So we're gonna end up taking off, bump stops, coil seats, track bar bracket, front axle disconnect, shock mounts, knuckles, axles, everything. We're gonna get this thing completely disassembled, and then we're gonna start mocking up the Artec truss. So let's go ahead and get that done. So that is very strange. You can see that there on the camera. This bump stop has been pushed forward. So I know when I set this up that I had the bump stop landing right on the middle of that, but I bet you this thing is hitting so hard, or whenever it's compressed all the way, it's putting enough pressure to where it's wanting to load that bump stop to the front. So when I take these apart, we're gonna inspect that, figure out what we can do there to make that a little bit stronger. What we might end up doing is going back with a solid aluminum or steel bump stop that can secure down very tight without any kind of squishiness at all, which those bump stops there may be doing on us. But anyway, we're gonna go ahead and get this thing completely disassembled and start mocking up that Artec skid. So we have the Artec control arm skid plates here, and as you can see, the outside is still bare metal, but on the inside we've gone ahead and put a coat of Steelite paint on there. And these are really pretty easy. You just set them right in place. I mean, they fit just great. So what we're gonna do is mark and grind some paint off here on the axle where it's not already been scraped off by the rocks. And then we'll go back and set this control arm skid plate on there, and then we'll weld it in, and then also weld up these seams where they manufactured it and did the bending and used the press brake to bend that. So we're gonna go back and weld up those 4 seams as well as that whole perimeter. We have these control arm skids finished up, and next up, while we've got this thing flipped over, is gonna be the Artec lower, not control arm, but it's the lower C gussets. So this is the bottom side of the axle we're looking at now, and we're gonna do the same thing here. We're gonna grind out an area, and we're gonna weld these lower C gussets on, and I won't bore you with all the time lapse and all that stuff of that, but it's basically gonna be the same procedure. We're gonna grind the paint off the perimeter, weld it on, weld up those seams, and this is gonna be a completely sealed and strengthened unit here on the lower part of the axle. So we're gonna do that now, and then we will flip it over and get started on the top. Okay, as you can see here, we've got this thing wrapped up, and that's where we took a torch and basically heated up the housing where the truss meets it. So this one will be, around this perimeter here. So what we've done is we've gone ahead and welded that one big section here on the housing where the truss attaches. And then we also welded the trusses together where they meet. And then we've also done this one little section here on the short part of that truss. But what that does is you're supposed to, since it's two dissimilar metals, you got steel welding to cast. And here's another section of that's gonna have to be done. So where this cast is welded to this steel, we're gonna heat the cast up, weld it, post-heat it, and then we're gonna wrap it. There's also some different wires that you can use for that, but we're just gonna roll with what we've got in the machine. So we're making some progress on this. We still have, of course, the upper gussets that need to go on. So we're gonna take a little break. The important thing here when you're doing one of these is you do not want to hurry the job. Do a little bit at a time. So basically what we did over here was we welded this up and then let it sit for a while. Then we welded the 2 seams together. That sat for a while. And now we just did this, And that's going to stay wrapped up for probably a good hour or two. And when we come back, it still might be just a tad bit warm, but you definitely do not want to warp the axle housing because you could ruin it and cause all kinds of other troubles. All right, so we've been fitting up this other piece here, and I had to really modify it quite a bit to get it to fit. The biggest issue was back here on the back side. It wasn't going to fit, and I slightly damaged the connector, but I still think it'll plug back in and work. But I had to enlarge the hole around there just so that connector will be able to come out. And then this thing right here was up about another 1/2 inch, so there was a gap from here all the way around to here that I could almost stick my finger under. So in the process of me, reforming that and beating it down with a hammer and whatnot, I broke that vent nipple. So I'm gonna have to fix that. But over here on the front, I must have a different housing than this is made for, but this right here, I had to grind so much out of this just to get this thing to fit down there where it should. So I didn't take anything off this side or anything off this side. It was all right here where that casting is. So I'm thinking maybe since this is a diesel, this casting might be a lot thicker. But anyway, it's going together, and we're gonna go ahead and get this welded on the steel side here. That way we can transfer the blanket over to the casting side and get this welded on. So we've got the axle all painted up with at least the first coat of paint. So we've got, of course, the main part of the truss with the extension, the upper and lower C gussets, and then down here on the bottom we've got lower control arm skid plates. We've put a coat of paint on all of those. We're gonna let it sit here and dry overnight, and then we'll come back in tomorrow morning and get the rest of this thing painted up and get it hung back up in the truck so that we can get the gears changed. As you can see here, we've got this heater on here because this thing is getting cold in the shop here. But you can see how we had to conform that around that connection and where I broke that sensor. But everything's welded on there, should be nice and strong now. But we've got to heat up this thing just so some paint will stick because it's about 48 degrees in here today. Clock is ticking on this project now. We've got the track bar bracket, a relocation bracket bolted back on. Everything's tight, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts tight. And then around here we had some fitment issues with this bracket and the truss, or I'm sorry, the gussets. So just ended up cutting this bracket down and actually welded it to the factory sway bar tab here. So this now cannot be removed unless it's cut off. But over here on this other side where we had that issue where what happened was I broke this fitting off. So we tapped this hole in the housing to 1/4 inch pipe with a right angle, and then have a 1/4 inch pipe fitting here with a 5/16 barb for that factory hose. So that's all back together. And then down here we had an issue with where I'd put nut certs in the bottom of the spring seat. They had broken loose, and this thing was kind of just loose in here. So what we did was on the bottom side, well, you can't see it, but on the post of the bump pad here, we sunk a 1/2 inch 13 nut and welded it in. And then also drilled out this bracket back here and took the nut off and got rid of that M6 bolt. And now we have 3/8 bolts holding those brackets on. So the gussets and truss are finished up, and now we just need to get in here to do our re-gear to 488. The gear that we're putting in this is a Revolution 488. And as you can see right here on our initial pattern, on the drive side of the gear, we are really high on the gear, on the tooth, on the drive side. And then on the coast side, we've got the same scenario. So what we're gonna do is we are gonna increase our pinion shim. In other words, we're gonna bring the pinion towards the camera here to get that pattern
down in the middle of that. So we're going to do that, and we'll run another pattern and share that with you. What we've done, we've added 6/1000 shim, and we've got this drive side looking a whole lot better. However, the coast side still is a little high on the tooth, but it is coming down in the right direction. So what we're going to do is pull this back apart, and since we saw that 6/1000 moved it that far, we're going to see if we can trade out that 6/1000 shim for a 10. So we'll do a 10 and then we'll be right back. So we added another 4/1000, and now you can see how the bulk of that mark is in the middle of the tooth, and you can see the top and bottom curve on the tooth on the drive side, and then same thing on the coast side. So it's a little high on the tooth, but you can see how it comes out and curves back in, so you can see the entire oval on the tooth, and it is not running off of the tip of the tooth. It's still got marking compound that's not been wiped off on the tooth. So we're good to go on the pinion depth, and backlash sounds correct, but we will get a dial indicator on there and check that. It should be in the range of I think 6 to 12 on a JL JT gear. All right, so backlash is around 8/1000. So what you want to do is just check that in about 4 different spots on the gear set to make sure that you don't have any run out issues. We chose to use the RCV axles mainly because, well, they are strong, but if anything is to tear up here or here, usually it doesn't explode and rip ball joints and knuckles off and leave you stranded. So this is still going to be the 2-piece style with the front axle disconnect. The reason we went that route was I like the way how nothing turns in the front axle when you're driving down the road. So it just, takes care of some vibrations and noise. And then also, if something were to break, the front axle can be just disengaged. Say a ring and pinion breaks, it can just sit there and the hubs can free spin. But anyway, this is the 300M version of these shafts. They're warranted up to a 43-inch tire, although I would never advise that. I feel like we're pushing it on a 44 front with 40-inch tires. So we'll try to be careful. You know how that goes. All right, here's the back side of the axle with the RCVs in there. And as you can see here, we added the Artec front axle disconnect skid. So everything's complete with the exception of one thing, and that's going to be this shaft right here. So when the RCV was in there, the wheel would not freely turn like it does right now. I could unbolt the 3 hub bolts and everything would be nice and free. So I ground off the tip of the shaft thinking the shaft was just manufactured too long, and kept grinding and grinding till I didn't feel comfortable grinding anymore. So we just put the stock shaft back in for now, and we'll get a hold of RCV and figure out how they want to address that. Since the factory axle had these TerraFlex spacers on it, it fits really well on the bottom side of this. You can see how it will index on and stay in place. And we had a retainer on the bottom and top where we had a wide bar that would trap the coil spring tail on the bottom. So let me show you the new axle. All right, so the new axle has a different post on the bottom, and these Terraflex spacers will no longer land where they need to go. So what we're gonna have to do is cut out the center section of these. And what I've done here, this measures slightly under 2.5 inches. So we're going to take a hole saw and drill out the center of these so that will fit. Okay, so here is the spacer with the hole cut out of the middle, and the 2.5 inch hole saw was perfect. I mean, it has just a tiny bit of back and forth movement, but we have a factory retainer, or not a factory retainer, but a retainer that comes with this axle. Let's grab that. So we'll still be able to capture the coil spring on the bottom, and it'll sit in the middle of this saddle because we still have a little bit of a raised portion for that coil winding to sit in. So that should work out just fine. So I totally flopped on getting video for the installation of the rear axle. And as you can see here, it has been a few months, or yeah, it's been a few months, I guess, several thousand miles. We have done that initial break-in service on the differentials, and then you can see here where we have that coil spring spacer in here to give us that extra inch of lift, and where we had to modify that. But also here you'll note that the sway bar is still not hooked up. Haven't gotten around to building that yet. So we're gonna have an Artec / Rock Jock sway bar in the rear of this truck. But so far the axle's doing great. You can see how the brake calipers are tucked up way up high, which is a pretty cool feature of this axle. And of course it has the XD60 housing with the big 9 or 7/16 bolts that has the O-ring around the perimeter of that. So here's the front side of that axle. You can see the brackets are pretty beefy. I think they're like 3/6, no, that's probably 1/4 inch. But anyway, you can see they've been used. Shocks get some use down here as well. Feel like they're pretty vulnerable. What we may do is add some bump stop up here, and then maybe cut these shock mounts and move them up. Maybe get a little more ground clearance there. But feeding this ProFloat 60 is a Knoxville Driveline 2-piece 1350 rear shaft. So the flange on the transfer case has been swapped out, and then we have our front shaft and then our carrier bearing with the CV, and it has this offset adapter. That way the drive shaft runs down, straight down the middle. I don't know if you can see that good in the video there, but if we look straight up at the shaft, it just makes a straight line down to the differential. These guys are great local guys that we deal with, and you can see it's got some scratches and scrapes on it, but no notable vibrations with those marks. But we'll keep you updated if we have any issues on this. And then of course that front axle has also a Knoxville Driveline 1350 shaft. But we're really pleased with this truck so far. It's doing really good. So stay tuned as we continue to build this beast. Since we have an air locker in this new rear differential, we had to tap into our air source here, which is a twin compressor mounted on an American Adventure Lab mount. And then I'll show you under the hood what we did to actuate that. Here is the ARB solenoid, and we've already installed onboard air on the truck, and that's right here on the side of the truck in this port for the electric port for the E-Jeeps. So right here, this bezel area right here, that's from 813 fabrication. And then over here where that hose runs over to that port, we just installed a 1/4 inch T, and then we have the solenoid here with a British to SAE adapter to put that solenoid in line with the air hose for our onboard air. Now, to actuate this, we have just the 2 wires here, and those are fed via this red and black wire, which goes to the back of the truck to the Z-Locker controller for the air locker to be actuated with the factory switch on the dash. All right, so now that we have our factory switch operating the rear locker, we must always have, when we're in off-roading situations, that is the rear compressor. So it will eventually build up pressure in the line and hose assembly and shut off, but we must have that on for the locker to actuate. So up front, we still have yet to do this side RCV, and I know that is complete laziness, but it's been really busy in the shop. But we did, when we serviced the axle here again on the front, we added the Next Venture Motorsports skid plate thing. So this is the newer style they have for the non-drain plug axle, and you can see over here it's got 2 smaller bolts for this side plate brace, whereas the other one had 3/8 bolts, so they made a change there. But this is the correct one for the non-drain plug style housing for the 2022 and newer, I believe. But it's going to add a nice piece of protection for the front of this truck, for the front differential. And you can see here our skid plates have gotten a little use already, and a little bit of scratching on the tie rod. We've rechecked our alignment here, and it was towed out just a little bit from the bent tie rod. So we got that straightened out, and we're just going to press on. We'll get around to putting that RCV in one of these days. And if you'll remember, that one was the one that was just a little bit too long, and RCV is telling us we need to take a chop saw, and cut it down by 1/8 of an inch or so to get that to fit. But anywho, that is it for now. That's the differential upgrade for our Project Gladiator.